When we think of a medieval castle, images of grand halls, nightly tournaments, and lavish feasts come to mind. In this picture, the kitchen appears as the center of abundance and culinary skill. However, the reality was much more prosaic and harsh. In fact, the kitchen was one of the most dangerous places in the entire castle, a place where people worked in conditions that would seem unbearable today. Here, in an atmosphere of constant noise, heat, and bustle, subordinates performed their duties, facing numerous threats every minute. The danger came not only from obvious sources such as fire and sharp objects, but also from the very organization of work, the architectural features of the room, and a basic lack of safety knowledge. Every day in a medieval kitchen was a kind of test, and surviving in these conditions was a real art. The castle kitchen was not just a place for cooking, it was the heart of the castle, but a heart that worked at the limit of its capabilities, constantly at risk of stopping due to disaster. Watch the video to the end to find out how this room became the most dangerous corner of the entire castle. At the center of any medieval castle kitchen was a huge hearth. It was not just a fireplace, but an entire system designed to cook many dishes at once. Imagine an open fire that burns constantly, hot coals smoldering on the floor, and smoke filling the entire room. This hearth was the heart of the kitchen, but also its main threat. Working near an open fire, which was a source of heat and light, required constant concentration and caution. Any carelessness, any fall or wrong move could lead to disaster. The fire could easily spread to the wooden shelves, the dry straw that sometimes lined the floors, or the cook's clothes. In a time when castles were built mainly of wood, this was a real threat. We are used to modern fire extinguishing systems, sealed hobs, and electricity. But back then, the only way to deal with fire was water, which had to be carried in buckets from a well, which was very time-consuming and difficult. Fires in the kitchen were frequent and spread quickly, engulfing entire castles. In such conditions, how do you think cooks were able to keep the fire going without burning themselves? Write your guesses in the comments. The hearth in a medieval kitchen was not just a place for cooking, it was the center around which the entire work process was built. Most often, it was a large open pit lined with stone, where a fire burned, and cauldrons were suspended above it on chains. The temperature around the hearth was incredibly high, and cooks, especially those responsible for boiling and frying, were constantly in the epicenter of this heat. Working in such conditions was exhausting and led to rapid fatigue. In addition, there were spits above the hearth on which meat was roasted, and cooks had to constantly monitor the process, turning heavy carcasses. This required not only strength, but also dexterity, as one wrong move could result in the spit falling into the fire. The coals that were raked out of the hearth were used for braziers, which were placed in other parts of the kitchen to maintain heat. But even these coals were dangerous, as they could easily ignite anything lying nearby. Thus, the hearth was not just a source of heat, but a constant threat that cooks had to deal with every day. Another problem was that cooks often used fat for cooking, and it could easily catch fire if it came into contact with the fire. In such conditions, when everything was saturated with fat and soot, a fire could break out at any moment, and it was very scary. In addition, the fire in the hearth was alive and unpredictable. The wood crackled, sparks flew in all directions, and any of them could cause a fire. Cooks had to wear thick, often woolen clothing, which easily caught fire if a spark landed on it. In addition, not only wood burned in the hearth, but also various dry plants that were added for aroma, and they too could flare up at any moment. Controlling the fire required not just skill, but instinct. The cook had to feel the fire, understand its mood. But even the most experienced cook could face a problem when an unexpected draft or the fall of a heavy beam could lead to the uncontrolled spread of flames. The floors in the kitchen, despite being made of stone, were often covered with a layer of grease and soot, which were highly flammable. And the only means of extinguishing a fire, as already mentioned, was water, which had to be brought from a well, which was very time-consuming and difficult. Thus, a fire in the kitchen could break out at any moment, and it was very frightening. There were no systems that could help cooks in case of a fire, and they had to cope with the fire on their own. Every time we watch movies about the Middle Ages, We see beautiful, clean kitchens where smoke escapes through special openings in the ceiling. But in reality, things were far from that. The chimneys were wide and often unable to cope with the huge amount of smoke produced during cooking. Smoke from the hearth, spits, and ovens filled the entire room, making the air heavy and almost unbearable. It stung the eyes, made breathing difficult, and made working in the kitchen very dangerous. The smoke not only caused discomfort, but also reduced visibility, which increased the risk of accidents. Cooks had to work in conditions where they could not always see clearly what was happening around them, which led to collisions, falls, and other incidents. Constant smoke inhalation also had a negative impact on health, causing respiratory problems. In such conditions where the air was heavy and filled with soot, the cooks worked until they were exhausted, but they had no choice. It was part of their job, and they had to cope with it. But working in constant smoke and heat was only part of the danger. Want to know what else made them risk their lives every day? Next, we'll show you exactly what devices turned the kitchen into a dangerous place. The chimney, or flue, was one of the most important architectural elements of the kitchen, but its effectiveness left much to be desired. Most often, it was a wide channel that ran from the hearth to the roof, but its design was far from ideal. The smoke produced by burning wood did not always rise upwards, but often settled in the room, creating a thick veil. This was due to the fact that castles did not have good ventilation, and the cold air that penetrated through the narrow windows created turbulence that prevented the smoke from rising. As a result, cooks worked in conditions where the air was not only heavy with smoke, but also with vapors from cooking food, which made the atmosphere even more stifling. Smoke and soot settled on the walls, ceiling, and clothing, making everything dirty and sticky. This not only created discomfort, but also increased the risk of fire, as soot was highly flammable. Cooks working in these conditions were forced to use wet rags to protect their eyes and respiratory tract from the smoke, but this was only a temporary measure. In addition, constant smoke inhalation led to chronic lung diseases, as well as headaches and dizziness, which could result in serious injuries during work. We should also add that the smoke meant that the cooks had to work almost blind. They couldn't see where they were going, which increased the risk of collisions. Imagine carrying a huge pot of boiling water and bumping into another cook carrying a huge piece of meat. This could have resulted in serious injury, burns, or even death. In addition, smoke and soot settled on all surfaces, making them slippery and dirty. This was very dangerous, as cooks could slip and fall on sharp tools or hot surfaces. Smoke and soot also settled on food, making it unappetizing. But that was only part of the problem. In fact, smoke and soot were very dangerous, as they could cause serious lung diseases. Constant inhalation of smoke led to chronic bronchitis, asthma, and other diseases. Thus, working in the kitchen was dangerous not only because of physical injuries, but also because of the risk of contracting various diseases, which were deadly in the Middle Ages. Medieval kitchens were full of huge and heavy tools. These were not modern knives and frying pans, but huge cleavers, meat hooks, and cast iron cauldrons that weighed several dozen kilograms. Working with such tools required not only strength, but also dexterity. Any wrong move could cause a heavy cauldron to fall, which was extremely dangerous. The cleavers used for cutting meat were very sharp, and working with them required incredible concentration. Imagine cutting up a huge carcass while standing on a slippery floor in semi-darkness, with constant hustle and bustle around you. It wasn't just cooking, it was a real art of survival. The utensils used in the kitchen were also very heavy. The huge cast iron cauldrons hanging over the hearth were very dangerous. They had to be removed from the fire and carried, which was a very difficult task that required the coordinated work of several people. One wrong move and the red-hot cauldron could fall, which was very dangerous. These tools were not just cooking utensils. They were part of castle life, and their use required incredible skill. The tools used in the kitchen were not only large and heavy, but also poorly balanced. Knives and cleavers were made of wrought iron, and their handles were often uncomfortable, which made work difficult. Working with them required not only strength, but also skill. In addition, huge wooden cutting tables were used in the kitchen, which were very heavy and difficult to move. The pots used for cooking were made of cast iron and were very heavy. They had to be lifted and lowered using special devices, but even this did not always prevent accidents. The spits on which the meat was roasted were also very heavy, and turning them required strength and dexterity. Working with these tools was not only hard, it was dangerous. Any wrong move could lead to a fall, and that was a very serious problem. In addition, due to poor visibility and constant noise, cooks might not notice one of their colleagues approaching them with a sharp knife or a heavy pot, which increased the risk of collisions and injuries. It should also be noted that there were no safety standards in medieval kitchens. The tools were handmade and each one had its own unique features. The knives were very sharp, but their handles were uncomfortable, which made work difficult. In addition, there were no knife sharpening tools in the kitchen, and cooks had to sharpen them themselves, which was very dangerous. The spits on which meat was roasted were very heavy, and turning them required strength and dexterity. But even the most experienced cook could encounter a problem when an unexpected draft or the fall of a heavy beam could lead to an uncontrollable spread of flames. The floors in the kitchen, despite being made of stone, were often covered with a layer of grease and soot, which were highly flammable. Thus, working with tools was very dangerous. Despite all the risks, cooks were forced to work in such conditions. Often they were not professionals, but serfs or servants for whom the kitchen was the only place of work available. They had no special training and learned everything on the job, which only exacerbated the situation. The huge cauldrons in which soups and stews were prepared could hold dozens of liters of boiling water. Controlling them was like juggling with fire. One wrong move and the hot contents could spill onto the floor, causing serious burns or even death. Leather aprons and rough clothing provided no protection. Cooks worked under constant stress, under pressure to feed huge numbers of people, from lords to soldiers and servants. In addition, carbon monoxide often accumulated in the kitchens due to poor ventilation, causing dizziness and loss of consciousness, making the work even more dangerous. Kitchens in castles were often very high. This was done to allow smoke to escape, but in fact it created another problem. The ceilings were high and often had wooden beams on which meat, fish, and other foodstuffs were hung for storage. To reach these items, cooks had to use tall ladders or unstable wooden platforms. Working at heights, with poor visibility and constant movement, was very dangerous. Any misstep could result in a fall from a great height, which was extremely dangerous. Falling from a height onto a slippery and dirty floor was a very serious risk. Kitchen workers were constantly on the move, which of course increased the risk of accidents. But what else besides falls constantly threatened the lives of chefs in a medieval kitchen? Read on and we'll reveal the dangers lurking in every pot and vat. The height of the kitchen ceilings was not just an architectural feature, but a necessity dictated by the technology of food preparation. The chimney that stretched from the hearth was very wide, and for it to work, the room had to be high. But this created a problem. Above the hearth, on the ceiling, there were spits that had to be turned constantly, and this required the use of special ladders or platforms. In addition, there were many shelves and hooks in the kitchen where food was stored. To reach them, cooks had to use ladders. These ladders were not very stable, and working on them was dangerous. Any wrong move could result in a fall, which was a very serious problem. In addition, the kitchen was very busy, which increased the risk of collisions. Cooks were constantly moving around, which was very dangerous. Imagine a chef, tired after a long shift, climbing a rickety ladder to get a piece of meat. And at that moment, someone rushes past him carrying a huge pot of hot soup. The slightest mistake could have had terrible consequences. In addition to unstable ladders and platforms, kitchen workers faced additional challenges. Often, to save time, they used improvised structures, wooden barrels, upturned boxes, or even chairs stacked on top of each other. These ladders were even more dangerous and could collapse at any moment. In addition, not only food was stored at height, but also various tools, which were also very heavy. Cooks had to balance at height to remove them, which was very dangerous. There were also many shelves in the kitchen where spices, dried herbs, and other food items were stored, and these were also very heavy. Thus, working at heights was not just dangerous, it was deadly. Kitchen workers had to be very attentive and careful. In addition to unstable structures, there was another factor that exacerbated the danger: the lack of lighting. In most cases, the only source of light was the fire in the hearth. This created sharp shadows and dim light, making working at heights even more risky. A cook could easily miss a weak step or a protruding nail, which could lead to falls. In addition, the kitchen was always hot and stuffy, which contributed to fatigue and loss of concentration. An exhausted and sweaty person on a rickety ladder is not just a risk, it is almost a guaranteed accident. Considering that there could be a hot stove or boiling pots underneath, a fall could result in not just injury, but instant death. There were no safety nets, belts, or other protective equipment, and cooks relied solely on their strength, agility, and luck. There were many hot liquids in a medieval kitchen: huge cauldrons of boiling water, vats of hot oil, soups simmering over the fire. Working with these liquids required extreme caution. One wrong move and hot liquid could spill, which was very dangerous. The cauldrons hanging over the hearth were very heavy and required the coordinated efforts of several people to move them. Imagine carrying a huge cast iron cauldron filled with boiling soup while surrounded by constant commotion. It was very dangerous. In addition, there were many hot surfaces in the kitchen: stoves, hearths, braziers. Everything was very hot, and any touch could be very dangerous. Kitchen workers were constantly in contact with these surfaces, which required constant concentration. They had to be very careful not to injure themselves. In addition to boilers and vats, other containers were used for cooking in the kitchen, such as clay pots and pans, which also heated up to very high temperatures. They had to be removed from the heat and carried, which was very dangerous. In addition, there were many hot liquids in the kitchen that were used for washing dishes. These liquids were also very hot and had to be handled with care. Kitchen workers were constantly in contact with these liquids, which was very dangerous. They had to be very careful not to injure themselves. In addition, there were many braziers in the kitchen that were used to keep things warm, and they were also very hot. Working with them required constant concentration and caution. Burns were a very common injury in medieval kitchens. They could be not only painful, but also life-threatening, as in unsanitary conditions, any wound could easily become infected and lead to gangrene. In addition to cauldrons and vats, other containers were used in the kitchen for cooking, such as clay pots and pans, which also heated up to very high temperatures. They had to be removed from the fire and carried, which was very dangerous. In addition, there were many hot liquids in the kitchen that were used for washing dishes. These liquids were also very hot and had to be handled with care. Kitchen workers were in constant contact with these liquids, which was very dangerous. They had to be very careful not to injure themselves. In addition, there were many braziers in the kitchen that were used to keep things warm, and they were also very hot. Working with them required constant concentration and caution. Burns were a very common injury in medieval kitchens. They could be not only painful, but also life-threatening. As in unsanitary conditions, any wound could easily become infected and lead to gangrene. In addition to the obvious danger of burns, there was a less obvious but no less serious threat: falling into the cauldron. Huge cast iron cauldrons filled with boiling water or hot oil stood directly on the floor or on low stands. In cramped, busy conditions with poor visibility, a cook could easily trip and fall straight into boiling water. This meant instant death. Considering that these boilers were used to cook meals for dozens or even hundreds of people, they were enormous. Unfortunately, falling into a boiler was not uncommon and was often mentioned in historical chronicles as death in a boiler. Also, when pouring hot liquid from one vessel to another, cooks could suffer severe burns, especially to their faces and hands. Clothes made of coarse fabrics, soaked in fat, could easily catch fire if a spark landed on them, creating yet another deadly hazard. Working in the kitchen was a constant battle with fire, boiling water, and heavy weights, where the slightest mistake could cost a life. The floor in a medieval kitchen was made of stone and was constantly flooded with water, grease, and food scraps. It was slippery, dirty, and very dangerous. Working on such a floor, in conditions of constant hustle and bustle, was very difficult. Any wrong move or fall could result in serious injury. The cooks who worked in the kitchen were constantly on the move, which of course increased the risk of accidents. They had to be very careful not to slip and fall. In addition, there were many heavy objects in the kitchen that could fall on the floor, which was very dangerous. Kitchen workers were constantly at risk, and this was a very serious problem. What do you think was the hardest thing for the chefs? The constant threat of falling, or something else that wore them down every day? Let's take a look at why they worked themselves to exhaustion. The kitchen floor was not just slippery, it was also uneven. The stone slabs were not laid very evenly and often had cracks and potholes. This made working in the kitchen even more dangerous. The chefs who worked in the kitchen had to constantly watch their step to avoid tripping and falling. In addition, there were many heavy objects in the kitchen that could fall on the floor and create even greater danger. Working in the kitchen was very difficult and required not only strength, but also dexterity. Cooks had to be very careful not to injure themselves. In addition, there was no special footwear for cooks in the kitchen. They worked in regular shoes, which quickly became wet and slippery. Thus, even the most ordinary movement could lead to serious injuries, fractures, and dislocations, which in the absence of medical care could be fatal. In addition to the slippery floors, the kitchen was very busy, which increased the risk of collisions. The cooks were constantly moving around, which was very dangerous. Imagine a cook, tired after a long shift, climbing a rickety ladder to get a piece of meat, and at that moment someone rushes past him with a huge pot of hot soup. The slightest mistake could have had terrible consequences. In addition, the kitchen was very noisy, which made it difficult to concentrate. The noise from boiling pots, clanging knives, and conversations created a very unfavorable atmosphere. In addition, there were many different foods in the kitchen that had to be stored and used in a specific order, but due to the lack of proper storage conditions, the food spoiled, and this meant that the cooks had to work with poor quality food, which was very dangerous. Due to unsanitary conditions and lack of hygiene, the kitchen floors were a breeding ground for bacteria. Grease, meat, and vegetable scraps that were not cleaned up in a timely manner quickly decomposed, creating an unpleasant odor and attracting pests. Cooks had to work in conditions where flies and rats were commonplace. This not only created psychological discomfort, but also led to the spread of disease. In such conditions, even a small wound or cut from a sharp instrument or a fall could easily become infected. The lack of antiseptics and basic medical knowledge made any injury potentially fatal. Thus, slippery floors were not only a cause of falls, but also a gateway to infections that were untreatable at the time. Working in a medieval kitchen was a constant race against time and a struggle for survival in conditions that seem incredibly dangerous today. Working in a medieval kitchen was extremely hard. The working day began at dawn and ended late at night. Cooks had to work in conditions of constant noise, heat, and hustle and bustle. They had to be on their feet all day, performing a variety of tasks. They chopped wood, carried water, prepared food, washed dishes, and it was very exhausting work. Constant fatigue led to loss of concentration, which increased the risk of accidents. Cooks who worked in the kitchen were forced to work until they were exhausted, and this was a very serious problem. They had no time to rest, eat, or sleep. They had to work constantly, and this was very dangerous. In addition to physical labor, working in the kitchen also required mental effort. Cooks had to constantly monitor many dishes that were being prepared at the same time, which required incredible concentration. They had to be very careful not to overcook, undercook, or spoil the food. Working in the kitchen was very difficult and required not only strength, but also intelligence. Long shifts without breaks, lack of proper nutrition, and constant stress meant that chefs quickly lost their ability to work, which was very dangerous. Lack of sleep and rest slowed down reaction times, which was very risky in an environment surrounded by boiling water, hot coals, and sharp knives. Any mistake could cost not only the chef's life, but also the lives of other kitchen staff. In addition to physical labor, working in the kitchen also required mental effort. Cooks had to constantly monitor many dishes that were being prepared at the same time, which required incredible concentration. They had to be very careful not to overcook, undercook, or spoil the food. Working in the kitchen was very difficult and required not only strength but also intelligence. Long shifts without breaks, lack of proper nutrition, and constant stress meant that chefs quickly lost their ability to work, which was very dangerous. Lack of sleep and rest slowed down reactions, which was very risky in an environment surrounded by boiling water, hot coals, and sharp knives. Any mistake could cost not only the chef's life, but also the lives of other kitchen workers. In addition, due to the constant heat, stuffiness, and lack of fresh air, chefs often had to work in a state of overheating and dehydration. This further reduced their physical and mental abilities, making them vulnerable to accidents. Given that temperatures in the kitchen could reach unimaginable levels during the hot months, fainting and heat stroke were common occurrences. In such conditions, when a person is on the verge of exhaustion, even the simplest tasks such as lifting a heavy pot becomes almost impossible. Cooks who often worked without relief were forced to cope with everything on their own. This led to muscle fatigue, strains, and dislocations, which in the absence of medical care could result in lifelong disability. Thus, exhausting labor was not just a nuisance, but a constant threat to health and life. The medieval kitchen was a place where chaos reigned. Many people worked simultaneously, performing different duties. They were constantly moving around, bumping into each other, and it was very dangerous. Kitchen workers had to be very careful not to bump into each other, drop something heavy, or spill something hot. In addition, the kitchen was a place of constant rush. Food had to be prepared by a certain time, which created additional stress. The rush led to mistakes which were very dangerous. The chaos in the kitchen was caused not only by the number of people, but also by poor organization of work. There were no clear rules in the kitchen, and everyone did what they thought was necessary. This led to collisions, falls, and other accidents. Kitchen workers had to be very careful not to get injured. In addition, the kitchen was very noisy, which made it difficult to concentrate. The noise from boiling pots, clanging knives, and conversations created a very unpleasant atmosphere. In addition, there were many different foods in the kitchen that had to be stored and used in a specific order. But due to the lack of proper storage conditions, the food spoiled, and this meant that the cooks had to work with poor quality food, which was very dangerous. We should also add that there were no safety standards in medieval kitchens. The tools were handmade, and each one had its own characteristics. The knives were very sharp, but their handles were uncomfortable, which made work difficult. In addition, there were no knife sharpening tools in the kitchen, and cooks had to sharpen them themselves, which was very dangerous. The spits on which meat was roasted were very heavy, and turning them required strength and dexterity. But even the most experienced cook could encounter a problem when an unexpected draft or the fall of a heavy beam could lead to an uncontrollable spread of flames. The kitchen floors, despite being made of stone, were often covered with a layer of grease and soot, which were highly flammable. This made working with tools very dangerous. In the rush and chaos, communication between workers was almost impossible. Shouts and curses, the noise of the fire and cooking drowned out all attempts to coordinate actions. This led to collisions when one cook was carrying a heavy cauldron and another was chopping meat with a swing. The result could be not only spilled soup and spoiled food, but also serious injuries. For example, a cook could be stabbed or burned, which was deadly dangerous in unsanitary conditions. Constant pressure from the lords, who demanded that the food be ready on time, forced the cooks to neglect caution. In their rush, they might not notice a slippery spot on the floor, an uneven surface, or someone approaching, making every movement potentially dangerous. Logistical chaos was not just disorder, but a constant source of injury and death. Kitchens and castles were not only dangerous but also unsanitary. In the absence of running water and sewage systems, dirt and food scraps accumulated on the floor, tables, and walls. This created an ideal environment for the reproduction of various undesirable organisms. Cooking in such conditions was very dangerous, as food could easily become contaminated. Food storage was another problem. Food was stored in basements and pantries, but these were damp and cold, which contributed to food spoilage. As a result, cooks had to work with food that was not always fresh, which was very dangerous. In addition, there were no refrigerators in the kitchen, and food was stored in conditions that were not always suitable. Meat, fish, vegetables, everything was stored in open containers, which was very dangerous. Kitchen staff had to constantly monitor the food to make sure it did not spoil, but this was very difficult. In conditions where there was no knowledge about microorganisms, people did not understand why food spoiled, and this led to them eating food that was not always safe. The constant presence of rats and mice, which spread infections, only exacerbated the situation. Thus, working in the kitchen was dangerous not only because of physical injuries, but also because of the risk of contracting various diseases, which were fatal in the Middle Ages. In addition to the obvious dangers posed by insects and rodents, the water used in the kitchen was often of poor quality. It was taken from wells or rivers, which could be contaminated with waste. This meant that even cooked food could become a source of waterborne infections, such as dysentery or typhoid fever. Cooks also had to deal with raw meat that was stored without proper handling, which increased the risk of salmonella poisoning. A lack of understanding of basic hygiene, such as hand washing, meant that infections were easily passed from one person to another, turning the kitchen into a breeding ground for disease. Thus, unhygienic conditions were not just an unpleasant factor, but a constant source of danger to the health of both cooks and everyone who ate the food they prepared. The kitchen was the most fire-prone place in the entire castle. The open fire that burned constantly, the dry wood stored nearby, and the grease that dripped from the spits onto the floor all created a constant fire hazard. Any careless movement or spark could lead to disaster. The wooden beams on the ceiling were saturated with grease and soot and could easily catch fire. In the absence of modern fire extinguishing systems, it was very difficult to control the fire. Fires in the kitchen were frequent and spread quickly, engulfing entire castles. In addition to the hearth, there were many other sources of fire in the kitchen, such as stoves, braziers, and lamps. All of this created a constant fire hazard. Kitchen workers had to constantly monitor the fire to ensure that it did not spread to anything nearby. This required constant concentration and caution. Any wrong move could lead to disaster. Given that the castle was built of wood, a fire in the kitchen could have destroyed the entire castle and its inhabitants. Thus, cooks bore a huge responsibility, and their work was associated with constant risk. Even if they were very careful, an accidental spark or a falling spit could lead to disaster, and in such conditions, survival was very difficult. In addition, there were many other sources of fire in the kitchen besides the hearth, such as stoves, braziers, and lamps. All of this created a constant fire hazard. Kitchen workers had to constantly make sure that the fire did not spread to anything nearby. This required constant concentration and caution. Any wrong move could lead to disaster. Given that the castle was built of wood, a fire in the kitchen could have destroyed the entire castle and its inhabitants. Thus, cooks bore enormous responsibility, and their work was fraught with constant danger. Even if they were very careful, an accidental spark or a falling spit could lead to disaster, and survival was very difficult under such conditions. One of the most dangerous factors was the fat that constantly dripped from the spits and settled on the floor, walls, and wooden beams. This fat, mixed with soot, turned into a highly flammable substance. Any spark from the hearth or stove could cause an instant fire. Due to the lack of special firefighting equipment, the only way to fight the fire was with water, which, when it came into contact with burning oil, could only make the situation worse. Fires in the kitchen often started at night when everyone was asleep and spread quickly, consuming wooden structures. Thus, cooks were not just workers, but fire watchers who were responsible for the safety of the entire castle. Their work was a constant battle with fire, where the slightest mistake could lead to a disaster that would claim not only their lives, but also the lives of everyone in the castle. In addition, combustible materials such as straw for kindling, firewood, and wooden tables and shelves were often used in kitchens. All of this created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of fire. Even a small fire that started in one corner could quickly engulf the entire room. Due to the lack of special alarms and fire brigades, fires were often detected too late. The only protection against fire was the vigilance of the cooks and their colleagues. They had to work in conditions where every second counted, and their reaction to danger could save or destroy the entire castle. Thus, working in the kitchen was not just about preparing food, but a constant struggle for survival in conditions where the slightest mistake could have fatal consequences. Today, we have immersed ourselves in the dangerous world of medieval kitchens, where every day was a real test of strength. We learned about the risks associated with open fire, heavy utensils, exhausting labor, and constant chaos. This world is full of stories that may surprise you, and we look forward to continuing our journey through time. If you enjoyed this format, please let us know in the comments what you would like us to cover next time. Perhaps you would like to learn about the lives of castle jesters, or how these magnificent structures were built. Your ideas help us make better content, so be sure to share your suggestions. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new exciting stories.